calm side of things. Instead of focusing on a hapless everyman struggling to handle a strange
They looked at me first.
new...
Hey there, guys. All right, today we are back with some more overly sarcastic productions, and this time we are hitting up Trope Talk Magical Otherworlds. I don't know how many more Trope Talks I have left to catch up on. This, the Trope Talk series might be coming to a close here, or at least it won't be as frequent. It'll be just whenever Red uploads a new one. But yeah, this is essentially Narnia, Hogwarts, that sort of thing. I'm not entirely certain how much I will have to say here because this is something that I do not write in. Oh, Percy Jackson I think fits into this as well. Something I have read, but really it's something I think you really only see in YA and children's books, you know, Narnia, Harry Potter, Percy Jackson, that sort of thing. I feel like you don't really see it in adult fantasy. At least I have yet to really see it. Or well, I guess we could count I think it's called Umlaba. The kind of the underworld in Evan Winter's The Burning series. That might count as a magical otherworld. We'll see exactly how broad Red is going to talk about this because as we have seen historically a trend here in the trope talks, I tend to have I guess a very kind of narrow perspective on the tropes, and then Red comes in with the facts and is like, this is how broad the trope really is, yeah, dumbass. And I am at the end of the video I am just like, Red is correct. So with all that said, let's go ahead and dive in.
This video was sponsored by World Anvil, an exciting gateway to multiple universes that doesn't involve natural disasters, magical furniture, or getting hit by a truck.
Okay.
Inherent in fiction is the general understanding that the...
Wait, what fucking magical otherworld you have to get hit by a truck for? I can't. It sounds familiar, but I don't know off the top of my head.
The world the story is set in is not the real world, as this is what distinguishes fiction from nonfiction. It might on the surface look almost completely identical to the real world, albeit with a different set of people in it, but the laws that govern a fictional reality are not the ones that control actual reality. Instead of the massive objects bending space-time to determine their movement through the universe, the path taken by fictional things is determined by their narrative weight and how thematically important they are. Food is only eaten when the meal shows us something important about the person eating it. Bathroom breaks are sparse to non-existent. People speak in clear, unbroken sentences without stumbling or losing their train of thought. Characters wake up with perfect hair and makeup in luxurious, massive apartments they easily afford on a struggling artist's or student's salary. But this is all stuff that an audience is expected to suspend their disbelief about. For the purposes of immersion, the audience is guided to treat a fictional reality that resembles their familiar reality as if it is their familiar reality. To relate to the characters, to speculate what they would do in their situation, and to extrapolate from their real lived experience to fill in the narrative gaps that the story world leaves unexplored. It's not the real world, but it is.
Yeah, exactly. Like, you're not going to, like, Lord of the Rings, you're not wondering, like, while Aragorn, Gimli, and Legolas are chasing the orcs that have taken, Pippin and Merry, you're not wondering in all that, when do they poop? When do they eat? Right? That's just something, like, you assume that they are going to do, right? That's just a process that we just do. It's when it becomes something out of normalcy, is when it is something that gets mentioned. Or it will be if you see something that you perceive as normal getting repetitively mentioned, oftentimes that could be a sign that is something maybe you should pay attention to, because then there's going to be something different happening later on. Right? That could be some sense of like foreshadowing, right? You don't want to fucking hear about. You don't want to go through your character, hear about in the book you're reading. You don't want to hear about the character like readying themselves the start of every fucking day. No, that's just not needed. It's unimportant. It will slog your pacing down. So yeah.
It is the familiar world, and the familiar world doesn't even need to have all that much in common with the reality the audience is actually familiar with. Sometimes the familiar world is a humble farmstead on an alien planet in a galaxy far, far away, or a cozy cabin in a folkloric wonderland where elves and trolls are just a thing that happens. Or it used to look a lot like reality until all these zombies showed up. But these settings are...
Oh god, Last of Us 1 is such a perfect game. And Last of Us 2 is just, oh, so fucking bad.
at minimum, familiar to the characters that live there, and that familiarity resonates with the audience. Even if the setting has a lot that sets it apart from reality, the POV characters will usually be relatable in some way. Sure, they're living on a space farm, but they're bored because they have to run errands and they wish their stern but fair father figure would let them do something more fun and adventurous. Or they live in a well-furnished hole in the ground in a sweeping magical fantasy world, but their primary concerns are annoying neighbors and what they're having for tea that day. Audiences will accept some pretty wild...
Hey, don't forget about luncheon and brunch, second breakfast. You gotta worry about a lot of things as a little hobbit, okay? Lots of food to worry about. It's a very taxing process, Red, okay?
Things as familiar and comfortable if the POV characters are familiar and comfortable with them, and it doesn't take much to get an audience to look past the fantastical quirks and immerse themselves in a comfortable and aesthetically familiar world. And sometimes, stories do the exact opposite. Sometimes a story will take a character out of a fictional familiar world and transplant them to an unfamiliar otherworld, a whole new universe.
Oh yeah, Alice in Wonderland does this. I can't believe I forgot to mention that one.
And setting totally unlike their own. This ain't no urban fantasy where the fun magical stuff was right around the corner the whole time. This is full-on dimension hopping. This character, who was previously well inside their comfort zone, and the audience's comfort zone, suddenly finds themselves in a world completely unlike the one they're used to, and as a fish out of water, this hapless POV character finds themselves pulling double duty as the lens through which the equally nonplussed audience experiences this strange new world. This is where we find the magical otherworld, a fantastical setting our protagonist is completely unprepared for. Magical otherworlds are not always technically magical, but it's very common for them to be at least kind of magical. In a stock hero's journey format, this is where the characters end up after crossing the threshold out of the known world into the unknown. In these cases, the journey part of the hero's journey is often very literal. The hero somehow travels to this unknown realm and then spends a good chunk of the rest of the story trying to get back to their familiar reality, possibly finding themselves fundamentally changed by the journey when they do get back. In the meantime, the character will have a chance to explore the magical otherworld's many eccentricities, serving as a tour guide for the audience experiencing the whole new paradigm right along with them. Now, every magical otherworld is
a nice, cheap, and easy way to sneak in your world building and not really have to worry too much about how you're gonna fit it in, whereas you can just it's like it gives, it's a little cheat code right there of allowing the audience to be more accepting of info dump.
Is different, but we can split them up into three broad categories.
Personally, I am a fan of fantasy books. Like, I'm not a fan of this for kind of that reason, because I like the challenge of trying to weasel in, like, make lore just kind of like casually drop in, right? Like, not do that info dump. Whereas, I'm trying to think of a good example. I think George R. R. Martin does a really good job of avoiding info dump, and having characters just kind of think about an event or whatever, or like just offhandedly reference something, and then it is through those later offhanded comments and stuff like that where you the reader start to fill in the blanks on that bit of world building. That's my preferred style. That was a tangent on world building that was not necessary, but I said it anyway.
That help us define how exactly they...
You are watching these trope talks to hear me yap. All right, that is why we do this. This is Ryan's enrichment yap time. Yeah.
Work. First off are the worlds that are fantastically grounded. They might be full of dragons, wizards, aliens, etc., but these settings are fully real. They're not dreamlike fantasy realms of questionable solidity, they're just as real and solid as the familiar world was. These settings often utilize magical portals and/or time travel to explain how the characters traveled from realm A to realm B, and the characters are physically transported from one to the other. Travel might be very easy and fully under the character's control, like passing through a doorway or using an artifact or something, but it can also happen outside of their control, in which case case, their goal is often just to get back home. It's key here that there's no real
Ah.
question of the reality of their experience, though the character might initially think they're dreaming or have trouble proving to other people that it really happened. Characters in fantastically grounded Otherworlds will often give the heroes stuff they can take back to the familiar world to prove it was real. These settings will generally feel
Y'all, I gotta rewatch the Narnia movie, specifically the first two. I remember watching Voyage of the Dawn Treader or whatever, and I was just kind of... That one was just kind of meh. And I think largely that's because the Narnia books themselves kind of go downhill. But like the first and the second movies, I thought were fantastic. I really love both of those. I think I like Prince Caspian more than the first one, just because Prince Caspian is more that kind of stuff that I want in my fantasy novels. I really liked like the plot, and also the actors in Prince Caspian. But I gotta rewatch them to see if that still is the case. If I still like Caspian more than Lion Witch in the Wardrobe. But yeah. What was I saying? I forgot what I was saying. Oops.
Still very solid, populated by fleshed out characters with wants and needs and problems of their own for our POV character to get invested in. It's actually surprisingly common for this variant to involve time travel, making the fantastical otherworld the distant past or future of the protagonist's familiar world. Still alien and unfamiliar and frequently very hostile, but just as real as the world the hero came from because they're the same world. It's just far enough in the past or future to be unrecognizable. This is a cool twist that can add a lot of drama, especially if the character has traveled to a really bad future world and wishes to, for example, get back to the past to prevent this future from ever happening. In others, the character gets flung into the distant past where folklore and fantasy are just as real as everything else and has a neat adventure in their own past while missing the conveniences of the future. Though these specific settings don't always explain where all the cool dragons and wizards went when the future rolled in. This is quite distinct from the second category, dreamlike fantasy. These settings usually share the aesthetic of more standard fantasy settings, magical creatures, talking animals, stuff like that, but they usually feature a rather looser set of rules and world building. Stuff will just happen sometimes, often with little to no explanation, and the whole setting will feel a lot less rigidly logical than the familiar world the POV character comes from. These worlds are often chaotic to the point of near incomprehensibility, and failing that, will usually still be dreamlike and strange. Locations might be discontinuous or fluid, things will change without warning, stuff like that. This is common in cases where the reality of the setting is a bit ambiguous or allegorical, and it's possible the character is legitimately dreaming or imagining the whole thing. Even if the setting is confirmed to be definitely real, it'll have different rules than the familiar world. If it has some sort of internal logic, it'll be dream logic. Maybe locations are flexible and doors don't always lead to the same place, for instance. Or characters might have unusual abilities granted by this setting in the same way someone's abilities in a dream might have very little to do with their actual real-world capabilities. In a setting like this, happy thoughts and fairy dust might legit let you fly, for instance. These settings have the aesthetic and vibe of a dream even if they're just as real as the rest of the story. And sometimes these settings are explicitly dreams, though that doesn't always mean they're not real in their own way. And finally, we have the third category, game/story worlds. While the first category produces a setting that
Ready Player One.
it's basically another real world with just as many
Oh,
rules.
Spy Kids 3D. The superior story.
And the second category makes a setting that has fewer rules than the real world. This third category makes a setting that has more rules, because it's actually defined by those rules. Characters in these stories will find themselves in the universe of a game or a story, and the rules of the game or plot of the story define what they can and can't do. Characters might have multiple lives or a respawn ability, or they might not be able to use certain items because of class restrictions.
Can we please stop casting The Rock? He fucking sucks as an actor.
Characters from this world might be limited to scripted dialogue, stuff like that. This other world might not technically be real. In fact, it's not uncommon for these settings to incorporate virtual reality to explain how the character got from the familiar world to the other world, confirming outright that this environment isn't real in the same way the familiar world is real, but it still feels solid from a narrative standpoint because it has rigid rules. While the characters typically have a degree of freedom even within the constraints of the game and/or story, they still need to work within those constraints to make things work. Now, while these three broad categories are helpful in their own way, Otherworlds can be very unique and frequently have wildcard traits we should probably discuss before we move on. One possible option, for instance, is weird time stuff. Time doesn't always pass at the same rate in the Otherworld and the real world, so a months-long adventure might take only minutes in the real world. It's also
Time
not
is a
uncommon
weird
for
soup.
characters to age weirdly, like maybe they'll stop aging entirely while they're in the Otherworld, or they'll age normally but then revert back to their starting age as soon as they end up back in the familiar world. Another frequent wildcard is weird magic stuff. While it's very common,
Yeah, the how time worked in the wardrobe didn't really like does time just when they what was it was it when they just go into the wardrobe, time in the real world doesn't move, or at the very least it moves very slowly, but then time within the wardrobe like continues on, like goes faster. I can't remember. Was there even an explanation for it that made any semblance of sense? I don't know. I can't remember.
common for magical otherworlds to be magical, Natch, some magical otherworlds also make the characters magical once they arrive, giving them access to powers or abilities they didn't have in the familiar world. It might be some untapped potential normally inaccessible by the rules of their home reality, or a full-blown magical transformation spurred by latent properties of the new universe, or just a thing they get taught how to do. The heroes may or may not retain access to these abilities after returning to the familiar world. And for the final wildcard trait, weird character stuff. Sometimes, instead of being physically transported to the other world, a character ends up basically possessing someone from that other world, like they're straight up body snatching. This is actually quite common in game/story worlds, which often have a
Yep.
rigid cast of characters that can't be changed, but it's still a bit weird. Now, of course, we expect our protagonist to be rather jarred by suddenly ending up in this fantastical otherworld, no matter how whimsical or magical it might be. As a result, it is very common for the goal of these stories to be escape the otherworld and get back
Run.
home. But it is also notably common for the exact opposite to happen, and for the characters to just stay in that otherworld forever, to the point where this is a foundational plot point for an entire genre of fiction called isekai. Those of you who already know what this is have been waiting for me to name drop it, and for everyone else, isekai is a Japanese genre of fiction that literally means other world and is sometimes also called portal fantasy. In its broadest definition, isekais are just magical otherworld plots. They focus on a character being transported to an unfamiliar otherworld and how exactly they deal with that. Even folktales like the story of Urashima Taro technically fall into this category, so there's a long history behind it. But uniquely, the isekai genre has a much higher than average incidence of an otherwise quite unusual otherworld plot, where the character who's transported to the otherworld never goes home. This is pretty uncommon because it breaks the hero's journey format. A big part of that stock structure is the hero returning home at the end, transformed by their journey but still closing the circle. Isekais don't do that as much, possibly because a lot of isekais involve the protagonist winding up in the magical otherworld by straight up dying. Being suddenly killed and waking up in a whole new universe definitely puts a damper on the going home side of things. Instead of focusing on a hapless everyman struggling to handle a strange,
They looked at me first.
new and frequently hostile world, isekais trend a little closer to the power fantasy side of things, where some mundane characteristic the protagonist has had all along makes them super special and OP in the
Red, what are you trying to do here?
magical otherworld. It's essentially escapism in its cleanest possible sense. A character in an unhappy or boring situation is transplanted wholesale into a more exciting one, where they're a super cool magical chosen one who everybody likes. This is actually a pretty common component in all magical otherworld stories. There'll often be some kind of prophecy in the
Jesus,
otherworld about a chosen
but
one from a
lion.
different dimension and how they should lavish them with praise and magic swords and stuff, but it's pretty unusual for those characters to stay there forever. But actually not unheard of. If you only know The Wizard of Oz through the movie, you'll probably be surprised to hear that in the later books of the series, Dorothy and her family just moved to Oz full-time, because while in the real world their farm is being foreclosed on and they've got nothing to look forward to but 2 world wars and the Dust Bowl, in Oz, Dorothy is a beloved hero, royalty, and maybe sort of dating Queen Ozma, and they can absolutely hook him up with a wing in the palace to stay there forever. So the concept of a hero with otherworld access staying there forever as their personal happy ending isn't unheard of, and it does make sense, because those magical otherworlds are usually a lot more exciting than the familiar world, where the hero is loved and respected for their heroics rather than just being another faceless cog in the machine. But even though the magical otherworld where our hero is beloved and respected might seem like the ideal place for them to settle down, a lot of these heroes aren't looking for excitement and heroics 24/7. Their adventure kicks off when they wind up somewhere scary and they spend the rest of the story trying to go home. They learn a valuable life lesson about the things they can do if they set their mind to it, and then they go back to their familiar life, changed for the better and better equipped to handle the trials and tribulations their world has to throw at them. But that's not to say the characters categorically dislike the otherworld and can't get out of there fast enough. It's not uncommon for the character to initially only want to go home, but to slowly become more invested in the Otherworld and the people they meet there, to the point where when they do eventually leave, their parting is at minimum bittersweet. And sometimes they'll even choose to stay, or they'll come back after a little while, or heck, they'll just keep the portal door propped open and pop back in to visit on the regular, which is probably the most unconditionally happy ending this kind of story can have. While these stories can end lots of different ways, it's rare for the character to give up on their home entirely and stay in the fantasy world forever. But that said, some stories where the character returns home at the end can feel unsatisfying because, well, home is comparatively boring to the magical dimension with dragons and princesses and hero worship out the wazoo. The character usually grows as a person over the course of their adventure, learning valuable life lessons and stuff they can apply to their life in the real world, but that can be a bit of a thin reward, especially since a lot of these stories end up framing the Otherworld as where literally everything fun happens. The familiar world isn't just familiar in these settings, it's unpleasant and boring and nothing good ever happens there. Sure, the Otherworld is scary, but it's also exciting and new and full of cool friends and wizards and handsome anime men. While the character often wants to go home, the
Handsome
audience
anime
isn't
men,
always
let's
on the
go.
same page, especially if all they've been shown of home is unpleasant mundanity. Plenty of Otherworld stories avoid this issue by highlighting that the Otherworld, while exciting, is not better for long-term living than the familiar world. Sometimes they get this across by making the Otherworld actually physically limited, like the space is very small, which is the approach taken by Infinity Train, where the train contains lots of fun extra-dimensional train cars full of miniature worlds of their own, several of which are actually quite cute and pleasant, but the world outside the
Dogworld.
train is a barren wasteland full of nothing but dead trees and life-sucking giant cockroaches, and the world inside the train isn't actually much better, having something of the technologically advanced unstable VR dystopia about it. The characters stuck on the train want to get off the train, and the audience sympathizes. Other stories will make the audience root for the protagonist going home because the world they end up in is so thoroughly hostile that the cool adventures they have there don't end up looking like any fun. But ultimately, if an Otherworld story doesn't actually show the audience what the protagonist likes about their familiar world, it'll be hard to convince them they want to go back. And in stories where the protagonist doesn't like anything about the familiar world before their trip to the Otherworld, the story has two choices: have their fantastical journey teach them to appreciate their familiar life and the things they previously disliked about it, or treat the Otherworld as a way out of their boring or unpleasant life and let them stay there forever as an escapist power fantasy happy ending. And while there's nothing wrong with an escapist power fantasy or two, it always strikes me as maybe not the healthiest approach. Otherworld stories, as a rule,
Yeah, because like it gets into the kind of I don't know how to explain most effectively. But essentially kind of gets into the idea of you can't. It's essentially kind of I want to say promoting, but I can't think of a better word for it. Promoting pure escapism, which is not something that exists. You can't just. Unfortunately, we can't just run off and escape, which of course, for some people consuming that material, it can be comforting to them to read that material where this protagonist is able to escape their reality and live in a world that does fulfill them and make them happy. For some people, that can be something they can enjoy to consume and can be even fulfilling and helpful to them in maneuvering our reality here on Earth. Obviously, I think based on how Red's reaction here was, Red is not the kind of person that necessarily enjoys that kind of stuff and doesn't like that full sort of escapism. And maybe she wants something similar to me, because I also do not like that full, complete escapism, where the characters address the problems that they have, issues that they have. They like find a way to deal with them if they get an appreciation for them, or when they go back to their real world, they go about trying to find some way to fix the things that they do not like about their world, their reality, right? That's the stuff I enjoy way more than the, just pure escapism. But yeah, pure escapism still has a place. If it's something you enjoy, do not worry. There will always be that art for you, and you can also still, if that's stuff you enjoy writing, keep writing it, right? There's always a place for that stuff. There's a place for like all art.
Rule ground their starting point pretty firmly in a close approximation of actual reality. That's what makes the Otherworlds stand out so much in comparison. And engaging with art is, on the most basic possible level, somewhat escapist in that it encourages the audience to immerse their mind in a fictional environment as opposed to reality. When you combine these factors into the full escapism subgenre, you end up with a story that puts audiences in the head of a POV character with basically nothing to live for, who ends up dropping out of reality and into an escapist and frequently canonically fictional universe to stay there full time rather than ever clicking back in with their real world. But while the character can stay in the Narnia MMO forever, the audience will run out of story and end up back in the actual real world. Now obviously fiction and reality are separate and audiences are capable of telling them apart, but this very specific escapist subgenre hits a little closer to home than average because it is about a character escaping reality through fiction, in a way that's totally awesome with no downsides that a real audience can never do. It's almost like, I don't know, going swimming in the winter. The water's heated and the experience is pleasant as long as you're in it, but the minute you get out of the pool, reality becomes a lot more unbearable. I don't mind these stories, but they always leave me feeling pretty hollow, which clearly isn't the intended emotional impact of a story format that's supposed to be a happy, fun-time power fantasy. It feels, I guess unsurprisingly, divorced from reality and hard to relate to. For a genre I mostly like, these very specific magical otherworld plots leave me pretty cold. And a lot of them really don't feel like they need to be magical otherworld stories. They can just be stories set in the world. If the character spends the first 5 minutes of the story in the real world doing very little of interest before being permanently transported into an existing fictional universe like a game or a story, frequently becoming an established character in that universe, what does that person add to the story by being from the real world? Why can't the story just be the story of that game or book they end up in? Now, this is a solvable problem. As I understand it, a lot of these stories do actually explore that this character has foreknowledge of future plot stuff, access to powers or game mechanics nobody else does, and otherwise game-breaking abilities that let them take a more active role in shaping the story they're part of. But honestly, that's not unique to this genre. Plenty of stories have characters who can see the future or have weird, quirky superpowers or fourth-wall-breaking abilities. In some of these stories, it really feels like the character's only from the real world to make it easier to project onto them, which circles back to the escapism stuff that I personally don't find all that interesting. It also adds layers of narrative disbelief the audience has to keep suspending for basically no narrative benefit. It just feels a little weird. I think I'd rather just read the story than read a story about a boring everyman reading the story and then playing out his own self-insert fanfic with that story. Magical otherworld stories can be so much more than that, and are usually a lot more fun when they explore both worlds and how the character feels about their journey through them, rather than just serving as an intro to an otherwise completely basic fantasy story. There's a lot of really fun stuff in this genre. It's just worth exploring, you know? But maybe not staying there forever. So, yeah. And thanks again to World End.
And that was Trope Talk, Magical Otherworlds. And I think the trope, in terms of my reactions to this series by Red here, is if I do not say, like, if I say, oh, I don't think I'm going to have much to say here, then the video is going to be over 40 minutes long. But if I say nothing like that, the video will be under 30 minutes. Is what it seems like. Huh. Anyways, that was Trope Talk, Magical Otherworlds. I don't really have anything to add on here that Red did not already say, or that I did not already say in the video while watching it. So yeah, I hope you guys enjoyed. Remember to hit that like button and subscribe for more, and I will see you guys in the next video. Peace.